Thank you, Ellie. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be sharing with you the latest Afrobarometer data. Actually, I'm sharing with you two main rounds of Afrobarometer data. So the first is our round 8 surveys, which was conducted in about 34 African countries between 2019 and 2021. I'm hoping that Lillian will help share the screen so that we'll all see what we're talking about. And then secondly, I'll also be sharing some data from our latest round of surveys. We're hoping to have about 40 countries data set very soon. But for now, I'm going to be sharing with you the latest that we have from 28 African countries. And this was conducted between 2021 and 2022. So let's start with the perceived positive influence of China and the US. Please move to the next slide. So the latest Afrobarometer data show that about half of respondents rates the economic and political influence of China as positive. And then we have a similar proportion, that's like 49%, also saying that the political and economic influence of the US on their country is positive. And so when you look at the perceived views of China and the US, you see that they are at par, according to the chart on your screen now. But generally, if you compare this over time, you see that the positive views of both superpowers have declined sharply in most of the countries. So we have only Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is actually only the only country that shows an increase in the perceived positive view of China. If you compare our round 9 data to our round 8 data, that means that in the past 3 years, Sierra Leone is the only country that's saying that the positive views of China or the positive influence of China and the positive influence of the US has increased. For most of the countries, majority of the countries, we are seeing drastic declines in the perceived positive influence of these two superpowers. And so basically the data is suggesting that when it comes to the perceived influence of these two superpowers, they are at par, and they both seem to be falling together. So in countries like Morocco, Botswana, and the Gambia, we see very drastic declines in the proportion who are saying that China's political and economic conditions on their country are positive. So for instance, in Morocco, we see about a 30 percentage point decline. Botswana is showing a 29 percentage point decline, and then the Gambia is showing a 27 percentage point decline. Please let's move to the next slide. In round 8, we asked our respondents in the 34 countries that we surveyed to tell us what their preferred development model is. And so we listed a host of countries. We had the USA, China, South Africa, their former colonial powers, and other countries such as Ethiopia. And our data shows that when it comes to the country that Africans think is the best model for development, then we have the US topping the list, followed by China, and then just about 12% cited South Africa, and we had about 11% citing their former colonial powers. Next slide, please. Now, when you break this down according to countries, we see here that China was cited as the #1 development module in only 5 out of the 34 countries. So these are Benin, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Botswana. And so looking at the trend, you realize that 4 of these 5 countries are Francophone countries. And then the US topped the ranks in 23 out of the 34 countries, including countries like Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Morocco. Next slide, please. Now, in the survey that we had just before I shared the data, we talked a lot about developments, China's developments in infrastructure, China's investments in Africa. Well, in round 8, again, we also asked citizens, one, if they are even aware of the loans and development aid that their countries get from China. Now, out of those who said, please move to the next slide. Out of those who said they are aware of these development aid and loans from China, we had about 3/4 saying that they are aware that their countries are supposed to pay back these loans. And a majority of those who are aware of these loans are also concerned that their countries have borrowed a bit too much from China. And the countries that top the list when it comes to the anxiety about the loans that their countries have taken from China are Kenya. So in Kenya, we had about 87%, and then we had 79% of Namibians and 77% of Zimbabweans and 75% of Angolans saying that they're quite concerned that their countries are a bit too indebted to China. But on the flip side, we had just about, in countries such as Tanzania, Sierra Leone, and Botswana, we had just about 3 in 10 expressing such concerns. Next slide, please. So the next slide talks about their views on the strings that are attached to these loans. And so among those who say that, who are aware that their countries had received loans or some form of development assistance from China, we had just about 1/4 saying that compared to the other donors, China sort of attaches more requirements to their assistance. And then we had about 4 in 10 saying that China actually has fewer strings attached to their loans and their development assistance compared to other superpowers. So I'm going to end the presentation here, but basically in summary, what we derive from the Afrobarometer findings are that, I mean, basically when you're comparing the perceived influence of the US and China, you realize that these two countries are at par. And actually the countries that we have majorities saying that the US's influence is positive are also very likely to have majorities saying that the Chinese influence are positive. And so they sort of go hand in hand. And then over time, we are seeing significant declines in the perceived influence of these two superpowers. And again, their perceived influence are at par, and they seem to be declining almost at the same rate in most of the African countries that we've looked at so far. Thank you.